Good afternoon. This afternoon, we'd like to introduce to you our new release, CabWriter 6, and we're going to do it in a few parts. This Part 1 video, What's New in CabWriter 6 Part 1, deals with just the functionality changes that are CabWriter functionality changes. What do I mean by that? Well, you're going to learn in a while that we've added a whole new set of functionality to CabWriter called ClosetWriter. But we're going to put that off until Part 2. Here in Part 1, we're going to deal just with CabWriter. And so with that in mind, let's get started. Let's look at the base cabinets here. This is what we call a Lazy Susan base. It's got a bifold door, and it's fairly large, so you can fit a rotating tray with a 90-degree pie shape cut out of it so that you can store things in there and access them easily by just rotating the tray. We didn't provide that cabinet in the uppers initially because there was no way to really, given the dimensions of the cabinet, if it were an upper cabinet, to fit the rotating tray in there. But it has other advantages, and that is when you open this door, and let me just take the base doors off, you got complete access to this area in here. And so in the past we didn't have that in the upper cabinets. What you would have to do to sort of emulate that up there is to have a blind cabinet here and a standard cabinet here. With the blind cabinet you could reach back in here, but you couldn't access this storage back here from this side. So what we did was we implemented a bifold upper cabinet. And so how do you use it? Well, what I'm going to simply do here is I'm going to edit this cabinet. And I'm going to use the stored defaults. But I'm going to select, instead of a diagonal corner upper, I'm going to select a new cabinet, bifold corner upper. By the way, this gives us 6 types of upper cabinets. One of them being a divided upper, which you can create, cabinets with up to 15 compartments. But the other 5, were standard, but now we're adding 1 to it, or actually to make it 5, we're adding the bifold corner upper to make it 5. Well, I'm going to choose that, and I'm going to say OK. And now notice that I have a bifold cabinet up there. Now I'm going to have to fix this trim up, but just for the moment, let me take the base trim out of there. I'm sorry, the crown molding out of there. And let's take the upper doors off. So now notice you can get in there and access all of this storage once the bifold door is open. And so that's pretty handy. So that's what we now have added to the list. And you draw it just like you draw any other corner cabinet, whether it's the diagonal corner cab or a Lazy Susan on the base. Now it's a typical corner cabinet. You just choose bifold instead of one of the others. Okay, I'll give you an example. I'll show you. I'll actually draw one of these just so you can see how we draw it. I'll start with the story stick. and I want to create this upper bifold cabinet. So I'll go here to where these lines cross, click again, and now since it's a corner cabinet, you have to choose from the corner cabinet list. So I'm going to start with the left pivot connector. Now I'll hit the Control key and come out 14 inches and back, and I'll choose a right connector. Both of these are connectors. This is a pivot connector, left pivot connector, and this is a right connector. So we're going to put this cabinet in here, and it's going to be able to connect to other cabinets. So I'm going to choose my new bifold. Notice I can only choose 1 or 0 doors, not 2. But since it's a bifold, it's going to appear as a 2-door cabinet. And there you go. Now I can add other cabinets out here or here. And if I take the upper door off, you can see you can easily access all of this storage in here. And like I said before, you could emulate this by making this a blind cabinet, but then you couldn't reach this area from this door. So this is a much more useful type of corner cabinet for the uppers. So with that, let's move on to our next topic. Each of the 4 images before you are done in a style that I call stacked upper cabinets. Each upper cabinet is actually 2 cabinets, one lower and one upper in a vertical direction. And in the past with SketchUp, if you wanted to design to this style, you actually had to create 2 upper cabinets and stack them, literally stack them one on top of the other. That's no longer the case. This is a very popular style, and we've been asked over the years to try and create this style. Well, you asked, we've delivered. Up until now, there were 5 upper cabinets, 5 distinct cabinet designs for upper cabinets that you could choose from. There are now 6. 5 of them are shown here. This excludes the divided upper. Notice a new one has been added. That's this one right here. That's called a bifold corner upper. Bifold because the doors typically come out in a bifold fashion. But the important part that we've added now is that these 5 cabinets can be drawn as they always have been, with just one upper cabinet, or you can specify a fixed shelf at some position, and then you will split this into 2 upper cabinets stacked on top of one another. And these are drawn exactly the way the normal upper cabinets are. It's just that you've specified a fixed upper shelf. So let's take a look at some of these and just look at what some of the tricks are. This is a very tall refrigerator, taller than normal. Normally it would be about this tall. But if I take a look at the parameters used to draw this, I will notice in the upper cabinets tab, there are 2 new defaults called stacked cabinet, and you can choose yes or no, and fixed shelf distance. Now this distance is measured from the bottom of the cabinet, and that's normally from here along this line. This is the line where the storage stick was created, right there. The storage stick was created right here along this line, and that's true of this cabinet as well. And so the height of this cabinet is now defined as this dimension from here to here. (35.5 inches). It would normally have been about 17 inches. Now, if I remove the front doors, you'll notice I've got a fixed shelf here, and I've also got a rail. The fixed shelf is 17 5/8 inches up from the bottom. So let's just see where that is. (17 5/8 inches). I'll just type that in. If I take that rail out by taking the face frame off, that distance is actually the bottom of the fixed shelf. If I look at this front on. There you go. That's the bottom of that fixed shelf. It's 17 5/8 inches from the bottom, which is this line right here. Not from the lower bottom of the cabinet, because there is an inset here. So it's actually from where you drew the storage stick, the construction line where you drew the storage stick, to the bottom of the fixed shelf. I have added a rail here. If I look at face frame, notice I'm drawing the mid rail. It's being drawn. Now, where does the mid rail start? Well, if I look at the carcass tab, notice that the fixed shelf offset is 5/8 of an inch. So what happens here is, if we come down from this dimension, 5/8 of an inch, and put the face frame back, you'll notice that's the bottom of the rail. So the bottom of the rail is the dimension from the bottom of the cabinet up the fixed shelf distance, and then back down the offset distance. That's a little tricky, but you have to figure it out and remember it. So this cabinet, by the way, the cabinet height, like I said, is 35.5 inches, and the cabinet depth is quite deep. It's 30.5. It's a refrigerator cabinet, not surprising. This particular cabinet, I put overlay doors on it as a style. The other thing I need to mention is this dimension is not from this point. The cabinet actually starts here. We just extend the bottom down to the ground, but it actually starts, the cabinet actually starts here. And that's true for all of these cabinets. They start right here. And if I look at the parameters for this cabinet, Notice it's 52.5 inches high. So if I take my tape measure and go up, 52.5 inches. And again, 36 inches is the distance from the bottom to the bottom of the fixed shelf. 36 inches. But then if I come down 5/8 from that, I'll get 35 3/8. Which is the bottom of the rail, the mid rail, if I should have one. So again, the mid rail is offset downward. Well, usually downward. This could be minus, but it's usually a positive number, which means the mid rail will be offset downward this amount from the bottom of the fixed shelf. Now, these doors, if I edit this cabinet, I'm going to say use the stored defaults. I can choose 1 or 2 doors just like usual. If I choose 1 and redraw it, that's what you get. If I redraw it again, use the stored, well, nope, let me cancel that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the face frame to no mid rail. I'll update it and I'll redraw this again. This time I'll say no. I want my new defaults to be used. And notice we no longer have a mid rail. So again, this is the same. In fact, let me do one more thing. Let me get rid of the mid rail. Let me change this to no stack cabinet. Update it, and I'll update this again. And say no. And now what I've got is a standard upper that's taller than usual. So these are basically the same cabinets we've always had, but now they have this feature. And I've drawn them in several styles. This is with no rail. This is a corner cab with no rail and slab doors. This is a frameless cabinet, but with frame and panel doors. This also is a frameless cabinet with frame and panel doors. This is a face frame cabinet, and now we're using cope and stick door. And this is a refrigerator cabinet with overlay doors. So you can use the old styles of various door types. I haven't included a one-piece shaker in this, but you can. And if you take the doors off, you'll notice that you have let me look at this cabinet over here. Notice I have shelf holes for the upper. I have shelf holes. You can't see them very well right here, but I have shelf holes for the lower. I also have hinge plate holes for the lower and hinge plate holes for the upper. And that's true of all of these. Here's the shelf holes for the upper, the hinge plate holes for the upper, shelf holes for the bottom, and hinge plate holes for the bottom. And the fixed shelf, by the way, has construction holes all around it, just like the top and bottom. So there you go. You can now use these to design kitchen cabinets with that stacked look, which is becoming pretty popular. Okay, so I hope that is an addition to CabWriter that you will find useful and helpful in your designs. Now we want to talk about a change that we've made to the rough lumber report. In the past, the rough lumber report included things like stiles and rails from doors, drawer fronts, end panels, back panels, face frames, and toe kick faces. Now we can include drawbox parts. That is, provided we created drawbox parts. So I'm going to start with a model that doesn't have drawbox parts, and then we'll see what it looks like once we create them and how we get those parts onto the rough lumber schedule. So let's get started. If I look at the purchase parts, you'll notice that the purchase parts are simple boxes because it was thought when this model was first created that we would buy our draw boxes from a third party. But now we've changed our minds. So we want to create draw box parts, and we want to include them in our rough lumber report. But before I do that, let me just show you the rough lumber report that's generated with this as the model. You'll notice this is the rough lumber report, and as we get down it, this is our rip cuts, and then we have our cross cuts. And the cross cuts include draw stiles, draw rails, door stiles, door rails, face frame stiles, face frame rails, end panel stiles, end panel rails, back panel stiles, back panel rails, and that's it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select all of these boxes. I can either do that. Let me do it this way. I'm going to create draw box parts. The scene I'm going to use is the purchase parts scene. And I can select any kind of box that I want here, but I'm going to select the simple box, just a butt style box. Now, I want to explain this a little bit. This is the butt style draw box, dialog box. And there's a couple of things you've got to be aware of here. When you change these simple boxes into this type of box, the materials used in those draw box parts is not defined on the materials tab. Rather, it's defined right here. So for the front, back, and sides material and resize dimensions, we've got sheet good currently, maple plywood pre-finished. Well, I want to change this. I want it to be rough lumber. and I'll make it birch. And if I'm going to cut them on a CNC machine, I probably don't want resizing. So I'll make this 0. Actually, even if I cut these on a table saw, I may or may not want resizing. I may want to cut them in 2 steps, or only 1 step. So I'm going to assume I don't want resizing at the moment. And again, my material for the bottoms wants to be sheet good, and I'm going to make it maple plywood. And I'm going to cut them on a CNC perhaps, so I'll make this 0 and this 0. But just be aware that the type of material that you use for these drawbox parts is specified here, and the oversizing is not specified on the cut list tab, but rather here. Okay, so now we've chosen all of that. We're going to draw them, and there they are. So that's part of what we have to do. The next thing we have to do is put this on the rough lumber report. I don't have them there right now, but I want the base draw boxes and the upper draw boxes included here. And of course I've got to update the rough lumber. And well, I'll leave this alone for now. You can actually get rid of the purchase parts scene if you want, but I'll leave it alone for now. So I'm going to go back to the rough lumber, and I've got my draw boxes on there. Now I'm going to recreate CabWriter documentation. I don't want a purchase parts report. And I'm going to use the rough lumber scene for the rough lumber report. And I guess that's, and I don't want purchase parts reports. So I guess I've got what I want here. So I'll recreate this. Now I'll open the rough lumber report. And let's scroll down. We got our usual reports. But look what we have now. Draw box parts. They're 5/8 inch thick. They're birch plywood. And depending on the depth of the cabinet, the widths will change for all of the various parts, and the lengths. So that's your rip cut for all of the draw box parts. And it's that simple. Okay, now let's go on to our next subject. To make things easier and less confusing to the user, we modified 2 dialog boxes. The production documentation setup box, dialog box, and the production documentation dialog box. What we did was we rearranged them and created a new dialog box called production documentation and label composer. To explain this, let me just show you what happens when you, in CabWriter 5, when you asked for production documentation. The first thing you got was this dialog box. And it would ask you for units, formats, measurement multiplier, display units, and restore units. And you almost always, with the exception of only a few of you, you almost always just hit OK and went on. And then you would get this dialog box. Well, this was a little confusing. So what we did was we took this right-hand side and put it in its own dialog box called Label Composer. And we took this part and we put it in this dialog box. So now the end result is a dialog box that looks like this, which is the Label Composer. We've created a new command for you to open this dialog box, and here's where you can compose all the labels that you will need for CabWriter. And once you compose them, generally you don't have to touch this dialog box again unless you're going to change what you want in your labels. But more importantly, when you ask for production documentation now, you'll get a dialog box that looks like this. And notice there's nothing here about labels. The old production dialog box setup is here. And then you have the usual choice of the type of delimiter you want. And then the assignment of scenes, and any oversizing on the sides and ends of doors and draw fronts, and finally the type of reports you want. And you can create reports from there. So I'm going to show this to you in the new CabWriter 6 code. So if I want to produce production documentation here, I simply go where I always went and say production documentation. And notice we didn't get the setup dialog box. We went directly to this dialog box. And here's where I can set up the scenes that associate with the reports and the type of reports I want, and then go directly to create reports. Now this will take a moment. This is a fairly large project. I get the usual message that lets me know where it put all of the reports. And I get the sheet optimization settings that I can set up however I want. And I begin my reports. Now, one of the things I want to point out here, one of the other changes we made, is if you were using a 4x8 sheet of plywood in your cutting, whether it was on the table saw or CNC, you would get a fairly smaller diagram here. And if you used 5x10 sheets, you would get the full diagram. I've modified that so whatever length you're using, it'll fit in this area. So this is a 4x8 sheet, so this is 96 inches from here to here. And this will become 48 inches. If I use a 5x10 sheet of plywood, then this would be 120 inches, and this would be 60 inches. So you're getting a bigger view of the smaller sheets than you did before. Other than that, there is no change here. Let me just demonstrate where that label composer is. Compose labels right here. That brings this up, this dialog box. And you can choose the type of labels you want to compose. And you can start filling them out. Notice a 60 label is a 5-line label, and a 63 label is a 10-line label, and you can begin to fill these out any way you want. So on and so forth. And they will be saved, so you only have to do this once, and then you can, unless you just decide to change the content you want on your labels, you do this once and forget about it. Never look at it again. We separated the label composer into its own dialog box and its own menu. It's found at CabWriter, Compose Labels. And what we've done in this release is we've added 2 more label formats. We've always had the 5160 and the 5163. We now added a 5267, which is 1/2 inch high by 1/2 inch high by 1 3/4 inches long, and the Avery 6792, which is 5/8 inches by 3 inches long. The rationale between these two was to come up with a format that if you're cutting things on a CNC machine, or for that matter on a table saw, and stacking parts, if you put the labels on the face of the part, when you stack them, you can't see what the part is. Now what you can do is you can take one of these 2 label formats and stick them to the edge of the plywood. And now in a stack of plywood you can tell which part is which by looking at the label on the edge. Now it's up to you to find a label that has good sticking power and isn't going to tear off easily. But at least you've got 2 formats now you can use. The 1/2 inch format probably is good for 1/2 and 5/8 inch material, and the 5/8 format is good for 3/4 material. But you can figure that out on your own. Notice also that I separated this drop-down list a little bit now. I organized them by how you're going to use them. If you're going to use them for your cut list, then you can choose from here. If you're going to use them for the DXF list, you can choose them from here. And if you're going to use them for the rough lumber cutting parts, you can choose from here. And for each one of these, you can have a different composition. You can define how the labels are formatted differently. And so I'm going to preview just a couple of these and show you some problems. For instance, if I want to preview my rough lumber labels, those I could use these 2 large formats. That's probably no problem. But if I want to use one of these small formats, let's say the 1/2 inch. Now these are laid out roughly the correct dimensions, so you can get a little bit of a feel for how things are going to go as you compose this. But notice I've got the description first, and notice that the description overflows that first line and goes to a second line. And then I've got the component number, and it's here. So I really only get 2 lines out of this. But it's also possible that if I preview this in my rough lumber list, let's see, I don't see any here, but it's also possible that this line can overflow as well as the first line, in which case you're going to be missing information. So if you're going to use these fairly short format labels, you want to be careful. Just because there are 4 or 5 lines that you can compose doesn't mean you should use them all. In fact, for the 1/2 inch label, I would stick with no more than 2 lines, and if you can get out of it the information you want using only 1 line, I would do that. So that's this new short label. I can demonstrate the other one. Here, let's see, we've composed it for 3 lines, and it's 3 inches long, so not likely things are going to overflow onto the next line. So that's a 4-line composition, but I would restrict it to 3 lines if you don't want to lose information. Now these also work. These also work in the cut list and DXF formats. So for instance, I have 4 of them here I can choose. I wouldn't use these 2 formats unless I were going to put my labels on the edge. If I were going to put them on the face, I'd use these 2 formats. But nonetheless, we can choose the 1/2 inch, for instance, and we can do a label preview. And again, that if you restrict that to 2 lines, you're probably okay. All right. So those are the 2 new label formats we've added. Now I want to discuss a new hinge plate type that we've made arrangements for. Here you'll just see a bunch of cabinets of all shapes and sizes and types. And what I want to do is take off the doors, both the upper and the base. And we'll just take a look at these doors. Notice that the hinge plates have vertical holes. They're 32 millimeters apart. They're 37 millimeters back from this face frame. And this is the way we've always done hinge plate holes. But now we have another option. We've added a default and a parameter and renamed another. And let me show those to you. We go to the CNC boring tab. Under the hinge plate system holes, notice that we now have a hinge hole direction. And like I said, it's traditionally been vertical. They're 37 millimeters back from the front hole. At the front hole offset from the front is 37 millimeters, and the hole spacing is 32. But watch what happens if I change this. I'm now going to go to horizontal, make this 20. and leave this 32. And I'll update this. And I'm going to redraw this cabinet. And I'm going to say no. And again, I'll have to take the upper doors off. Look what we have. We have horizontal holes. And again, this one is 20 millimeters back, but it still has 32 millimeters spacing. The same up top. You can do the same with this base cabinets. I guess the base cabinet. There's the vertical holes. And I'll take the base doors off. And notice now I have horizontal hinge plate holes. This works for every type of cabinet, including the divided base or the divided upper. So that's a change we've made for what's becoming a very popular hinge plate to use. And so now you can specify horizontal hinge plate holes. Okay. Now, this video is getting pretty long. It's almost an hour long now. So this is going to be the last section of this part 1 video. And what we're going to do is show you some changes we've made to back attachment each of the inset variants. I'm only going to describe full inset, but it works for all of the inset variants. And I'm going to scroll around to this cabinet right here. Notice right now that this is your normal attached back configuration. And if I open this up and look at carcass, you notice it's a planted back. This information down here means nothing because it's a planted back, so there are no grooves or anything like that. It's just a simple planted back. But I'm going to change it. I'm going to go to full inset, and I'm going to make the carcass groove width 1/2 inch and the carcass groove inset distance 1/2 inch. And let's see what that does. We're going to redraw this cabinet. We're not going to use the stored defaults. And notice what we have now is we have a full, just a normal 1/2 inch back, but instead of being planted, and let me just show you the back itself for the moment. It's a full 1/2 inch back, but it's just set in a 1/2 inch all the way around. So it's flush with the back side of the sides and this stretcher and the bottom. That's not terribly useful because it's tough to put screws around here because you don't have a lot of material to screw into. So perhaps a better type of attachment is, I'll demonstrate now. Okay, this time I'm going to make the carcass groove width 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 the thickness of the back. And I'll leave the depth, or the groove inset distance rather, the same. And the groove depth will be the same, 3/8 of an inch. And I'll update that. And again, we'll redraw this. We'll say no. Okay. Now notice the back is still flush with the back edges of the sides, the stretcher, and the bottom. And let me just show you what the actual back looks like now. Notice, if I zoom in here a little bit, notice it's got a tongue all the way around the back, a 1/4 inch tongue, 3/8 inches long, all the way around the back. And it sits into the grooves in the back. I'll put this over here. Yeah, that's a better look right there. You see this groove in the sides? And it's all the way around because we said inset full. So there's a groove on the bottom side of this stretcher and on the top side of the bottom to match where these grooves are in the sides. So let me undo that move. And I'm going to demonstrate one more option. I'll demonstrate a couple more options. Oops. So now I'm going to go and I'll leave this 1/4 inch. I'll make this 3/4 of an inch. So in other words, the groove is going to start 3/4 of an inch in from the back edge. All right, now look what we have. The back is inset 1/4 inch from the back edges of the sides, top, and stretcher and bottom. And I'll just pull this out again just so you can see it's still the same configuration. Here, it's a 1/4 inch tongue, 3/8 inches long, all the way around the back. But the groove now starts, oops, I don't know, I'm having trouble here. Let's start all over. The groove starts 3/4 of an inch back. So now let me show you one more. This time I'm going to leave this 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to make the groove 1/2 inch. I'll update that. Now notice, now my groove is a 1/2 inch wide, and I've got a 1/4 inch piece here. It's set back. The back is set back 3/4 of an inch. It's a 1/2 inch thick that's sitting in a 1/2 inch dado with 1/4 inch capturing it. Now I'm going to show you one more. While I'm at it, let me just pull the back out just so you can see that it really is a 1/2 inch back. It's a 1/2 inch back, no tongue. Actually, the whole back is a tongue. I'm going to show you one more. Now suppose you make the groove just slightly bigger than the back thickness. So in terms of 30/2 of an inch, the back is 16 30/2. Suppose I make it 17 30/2 and update that. I'm going to redraw this. Now look what happens. If the groove is bigger than the thickness of the back, instead of getting a groove, you get a rabbit. So if you want a rabbit, that's how you do that. Okay? Well, this brings us to the end of the video and part 1 of CabWriter 6. Part 2 is going to deal with the whole new set of functionality, and although it's completely contained within CabWriter, we call it ClosetWriter. So in the same sense that CabWriter can be used to draw custom cabinets, just about any configuration you want, ClosetWriter can be used to draw closet storage or any type of storage you may want that's not kitchen cabinets. The biggest use of that, of course, would be closets and closet storage, which these days are very popular. Most people are having their closets designed to have custom storage. So that's what ClosetWriter is for. And in part 2, we're going to introduce that. So until then, have a good day.